5 men walked into this jungle in complete silence. 4 days later, an entire Viet Cong battalion refused to leave their bunkers. The commander radioed headquarters with a message that would be classified for 40 years. "The phantoms are here. We cannot move. We cannot fight them. They are not men." And you know what happened next. The Pentagon drew a circle on the map around Phuoc Tuy Province and wrote 2 words that changed everything: Australian territory. Wait, the Australians, the guys from the land of beaches and barbecues, the force that numbered barely 500 men total, were given control of an entire province where 50,000 American troops had struggled to maintain order. Oh, this story gets so much darker than you think, because what those SAS operators were doing in those jungles, the methods, the transformations, the things they became to survive, was so effective and so deeply unsettling that Viet Cong commanders issued standing orders, captured documents that intelligence analysts would study for decades. The orders were simple and chilling. Do not pursue Australian patrols. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. If you see signs of their presence, withdraw immediately. One North Vietnamese officer, interrogated after capture, refused to discuss Australian operations. When pressed, he said 6 words that his interrogator never forgot. "They are not soldiers. They are something else." You're about to discover why a force of 120 men achieved what 500,000 Americans could not. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why the Viet Cong didn't call them soldiers or commandos or even warriors. They called them Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, and those ghosts changed the very nature of warfare in ways that still echo through special operations doctrine today. Stay with me. April 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The first Australian SAS patrols stepped off helicopters into jungle so dense that visibility rarely extended beyond 15 feet. The Americans who watched them disappear into that green wall expected to organize rescue operations within 72 hours. That's how long most small units lasted when they ventured deep into Viet Cong-controlled territory. The SAS did not need rescue. They vanished into the vegetation and became part of it in ways that defied everything American military intelligence thought they understood about jungle warfare. The Australian commitment to Vietnam had begun modestly. Military advisors in 1962, a battalion in 1965, and by 1966, the establishment of the first Australian task force at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province. The task force consisted of 2 infantry battalions, artillery, engineers, logistics support, and attached to it, rotating through on year-long deployments, a single squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment. Never more than 120 operators in country at any given time. These were the men who would earn a kill ratio that military historians still debate, still struggle to explain, still cannot fully replicate despite decades of trying. The numbers tell part of the story. Over nearly 6 years of continuous operations in Vietnam, Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted approximately 1,200 patrols. They killed or captured more than 600 enemy combatants. Their own combat losses totaled 1 man killed in action, 1 died from wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 wounded in action. Do the mathematics. In a war where American infantry battalions considered themselves fortunate to achieve parity in casualty exchange, where most units traded losses at roughly 1-to-1 ratios, the SAS achieved something approaching 30-to-1. Some sources claim even higher. These numbers seem impossible, fabricated, the product of propaganda, or inflated body counts that plagued all sides of the conflict, except they were verified by enemy documents, by American liaison officers, by intelligence assessments that remain partially classified to this day because they raise questions about American doctrine that the Pentagon preferred not to answer. But numbers alone cannot capture what the SAS became in those jungles, cannot explain why entire Viet Cong units abandoned positions at the mere rumor of their presence, cannot account for the psychological degradation that occurred when soldiers who had fought the French, who had survived American bombing campaigns, who had endured conditions that would break most men, began refusing patrol assignments because they feared something worse than death. They feared disappearing, vanishing without a trace, without a sound, leaving behind only questions that their commanders could not answer and their comrades could not forget. The transformation of ordinary Australians into jungle phantoms did not happen by accident. It was the product of selection, training, and a fundamental philosophical difference in how Australia approached special operations. The British SAS, from which the Australian regiment drew its lineage, and its motto, "Who dares wins," had pioneered many of the core concepts. Small unit operations, long-range reconnaissance, operating behind enemy lines for extended periods. But the Australians added something else, something drawn from their own unique history and geography. They added the wisdom of the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Australia's experience with jungle warfare traced back through the Malayan emergency of the 1950s, through the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo during the mid-1960s. In both conflicts, Australian forces had learned hard lessons about operating in tropical environments against guerrilla opponents who knew the terrain intimately. They learned that firepower alone meant nothing if you couldn't find the enemy. That technology had limits in triple canopy jungle, where visibility, communications, and air support all degraded to near uselessness. That patience, fieldcraft, and the ability to think like your opponent mattered more than the size of your force or the sophistication of your equipment. But the critical element, the factor that would separate Australian methods from everyone else's, came from an unlikely source: Aboriginal trackers, men whose ancestors had survived in the Australian outback for 40,000 years by developing sensory capabilities and pattern recognition skills that Western science still struggles to fully understand or replicate. The Australian military had used Aboriginal trackers in various conflicts, but their integration into SAS operations represented something new. These men brought knowledge that could not be taught in military schools, could not be codified in field manuals, could not be learned from books or lectures. They could track a man through jungle so dense that infrared sensors registered nothing but undifferentiated green. They could determine the age of a footprint to within hours by reading moisture content in disturbed vegetation. They could smell differences in diet from hundreds of meters downwind. They could detect patterns in the environment that indicated human presence, subtle disruptions in the natural order that most men would walk past without noticing. This knowledge, combined with SAS training in weapons, tactics, and survival skills, created operators who functioned on a different level than conventional soldiers. They became hunters in the truest, most primal sense of the word. The standard Australian SAS patrol consisted of 5 men: patrol commander, second-in-command, scout, signaller, and medic. Each man cross-trained in multiple roles. Each man carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment, ammunition, rations, and water. They moved slowly, deliberately, covering perhaps 2 kilometers in a full day's movement through heavy jungle. This pace shocked American observers, accustomed to measuring progress in map coordinates and scheduled objectives. The Australians measured progress differently. They measured it in information gathered, in enemy patterns observed, in ambush sites prepared with mathematical precision. A typical patrol might last 5 to 14 days. Insertion by helicopter, though as the war progressed and the Viet Cong learned to watch landing zones, the Australians developed elaborate deception techniques. Multiple helicopters, false insertions, teams that walked away from landing zones on foot, then circled back hours later to avoid observation. Once inserted, the patrol moved to their operational area, using routes that avoided trails, avoided obvious terrain features, avoided anything that might be watched or booby-trapped. The movement technique itself was distinctive. The patrol moved in single file, spacing between men carefully calculated. Too close, and a single burst of fire could hit multiple people. Too far, and they lost visual contact in dense vegetation. The lead scout read the terrain, selected the route, moved with a deliberation that American soldiers found almost geological, each footfall carefully placed, each movement screened by vegetation, no sound, not even hand signals most of the time, because hand signals require movement that can be seen. Instead, the Australians developed a system of touches. A hand on the shoulder meant stop. Pressure in a certain direction meant move that way. A series of taps communicated complex information without ever breaking the silence. Because silence was everything. The jungle at rest produces its own sounds. Bird calls, insect noise, the rustle of small animals in undergrowth, wind through canopy. These sounds form a baseline, a normal acoustic signature. Introduce a human, and that signature changes. Birds go silent, insects quiet. The jungle itself holds its breath around an intruder. An experienced tracker can hear this silence, can detect the absence of normal sound as clearly as any alarm. The SAS learned to move so slowly, so carefully, that they did not trigger this response. They became part of the ambient noise, just another element of the environment, indistinguishable from the natural world around them. This required transformation that went beyond technique. 3 days before a patrol, SAS operators stopped using soap. The scent of Western soap, of shampoo, of deodorant carried on the wind and announced foreign presence to anyone downwind. They stopped smoking a week prior. Cigarette smoke clings to clothing, to equipment, to skin, detectable from remarkable distances. They altered their diet, switching from Western rations to rice and fish sauce, eating what the Vietnamese ate, so their sweat, their breath, their very body chemistry began to smell like the local population rather than Western foreigners. And then there were the boots. This detail, small in isolation, encapsulated everything about Australian methodology. Standard-issue jungle boots, the pride of military engineering with their reinforced soles and ankle support, were discarded. The Australians cut away the hard rubber soles and replaced them with strips cut from old tires, shaped to mimic the profile of Vietnamese sandals. From a tracking perspective, from overhead, from any angle of observation, their footprints looked indigenous rather than foreign. They had learned from Borneo, from the Aboriginal trackers, that the smallest details mattered, that wars were won and lost in the space between what you saw and what was actually there. When asked about these methods by American liaison officers, SAS operators struggled to articulate the reasoning. It wasn't doctrine, wasn't something written down in official manuals. It was wisdom, accumulated through experience, passed from veteran to novice, through demonstration rather than lecture. One Australian patrol commander, pressed to explain his methods to an American major, finally said something that captured the essential difference. "You train to fight in the jungle. We train to live in it. There's a difference, and that difference keeps us alive." The Americans documented these observations in classified reports that circulated through intelligence channels and raised uncomfortable questions at the highest levels of command. If five-man patrols could achieve these results, what did that say about company-sized sweeps? If patience and stealth outperformed firepower and technology, what did that imply about American tactical doctrine? The questions were easier to classify than to answer, so they remained in archives, studied by analysts who understood their implications but lacked the institutional authority to challenge established methods. The Australian approach to reconnaissance differed fundamentally from American practice. American patrols sought contact, sought to locate enemy forces and engage them, calling in artillery and airstrikes to destroy what they found. Australian patrols sought to observe without being observed, to gather intelligence that would guide larger operations, to understand enemy patterns so thoroughly that when engagement came, it came on Australian terms with overwhelming local advantage. A reconnaissance patrol might spend 3 days reaching their objective, another 4 days watching it from concealment, gathering information on enemy strength, movement patterns, defensive positions, supply routes. They photographed what they could, sketched what they couldn't photograph, memorized everything, building a detailed picture of enemy capabilities and intentions. This information fed into task force planning, shaped larger operations, prevented Australian infantry from walking into ambushes because SAS teams had already mapped the terrain, identified the dangers, provided the intelligence that kept other soldiers alive. But reconnaissance was only part of their mission. As the war progressed, as SAS kill counts mounted, the emphasis shifted toward offensive action. The reconnaissance patrol became the recce ambush patrol, combining observation with the capability to strike and destroy. This evolution troubled some within the SAS itself. They understood that offensive action compromised their primary mission. Gunfire announced their presence, eliminated the stealth that kept them alive, turned reconnaissance teams into combat elements that attracted attention they were not equipped to handle. The debate played out in after-action reviews, in command decisions about how to employ this limited resource. Some commanders, understanding the unique value of good intelligence, tried to keep SAS focused on observation. Others, seduced by the remarkable kill ratios, pushed for more offensive operations, more ambushes, more direct action against enemy forces. The balance shifted over time, never quite resolving, always tension between using the SAS as scouts or as killers, between gathering information and taking lives. The ambush, when it came, was planned with extraordinary care and executed with surgical precision. Days of observation identified enemy movement patterns, which trails they used, what times they traveled, how many men in typical groups, whether they had security elements forward and rear. This information allowed the SAS to position themselves not randomly, but with mathematical certainty that targets would appear at specific places and specific times. The standard SAS ambush configuration formed a shallow L shape. 4 or 5 men positioned to create interlocking fields of fire covering a killing zone perhaps 30 meters wide. Claymore mines positioned along the trail. Command detonated to initiate the ambush. Each man knew exactly what his sector was, where his fire would go, what his responsibilities were if things went according to plan or if everything fell apart. They waited in absolute stillness, hours sometimes, muscles cramping, insects crawling over exposed skin, the jungle heat and humidity draining them physically and mentally. But they waited because patience was the difference between successful ambush and walking into a counter-ambush, between going home and becoming another name on the casualty lists. When the ambush triggered, it was sudden, overwhelming, and brief. The lead enemy soldier would step on a pressure-release detonator or cross an invisible line that the SAS had defined as the initiation point. Claymore mines detonated, spraying steel balls through the killing zone. Automatic weapons fire raked the trail. Grenades followed. The entire engagement might last 15 seconds, 30 at the outside. Then immediate withdrawal, the patrol moving away from the ambush site along pre-planned escape routes. Moving fast now, sacrificing silence for speed, putting distance between themselves and anyone who might pursue. Because pursuit was always possible. The Viet Cong learned quickly that Australian ambushes were small unit actions, learned that if they could fix the patrol in place, if they could get forces around them, the numbers favored the defender. So Australian doctrine emphasized what they called shoot and scoot. Hit hard, hit fast, and be gone before the enemy could organize a response. Don't stay to count bodies. Don't linger to photograph evidence. Strike and vanish, leaving behind only questions and fear and the growing sense among enemy forces that the jungle itself had turned hostile. But the ambushes told only part of the story. The psychological operations, deliberate or instinctive, created effects that tactical success alone could not achieve. The SAS understood, perhaps better than any other force in Vietnam, that the human mind was as much a battlefield as any physical terrain. That fear could paralyze more effectively than any weapon. That uncertainty could degrade combat effectiveness as surely as casualties. Some of this was deliberate. After certain ambushes, the Australians would position enemy dead in specific ways. Bodies sitting upright against trees, eyes open, weapons across laps as if they were resting. Playing cards, the ace of spades, which Vietnamese superstition associated with death, tucked into collars or pockets. These staging created scenes that the next Viet Cong patrol would find, scenes that communicated messages more powerful than any propaganda leaflet. The message was simple and terrible. You are being watched. You are being hunted. We can kill you whenever we choose, and you will never see us coming. Death comes from the shadows, from the jungle you thought you controlled, from places you believed were safe. Nowhere is safe. No one is safe. We are everywhere, and we are nowhere. We are the jungle, and the jungle wants you dead. Some of it was less deliberate, the natural consequence of operations that left no witnesses. Viet Cong soldiers would disappear during routine movements, would step away from their positions and never return, would be there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind no blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence of what had happened, just absence, just the empty space where a person had been, and the questions that ate at survivors. Where did he go? What happened? Could it happen to me? The psychological effect compounded over time. First one disappearance, then another, then patterns emerging that suggested something systematic was happening. Commanders tried to maintain morale, tried to explain the losses through desertion or simple carelessness. But their soldiers knew better. They had fought too long, survived too much, developed instincts about danger that could not be rationalized away. They knew that something was hunting them, and they knew that their knowledge provided no protection. Captured Viet Cong documents from 1968 and 1969 revealed the extent of this degradation. After-action reports mention Australian patrols in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or supernatural threats. Standing orders in some units prohibited pursuit of SAS teams that had been spotted. Prohibited because commanders had learned through bitter experience that following Australians into jungle meant walking into prepared ambushes, meant losing more men for no tactical gain. It was safer, orders stated explicitly, to let them go and hope they would not return. But the Australians always returned. Political officers, responsible for maintaining morale and revolutionary spirit, struggled with the Australian problem. How do you maintain fighting spirit when your soldiers fear an enemy they cannot see, cannot understand, cannot fight on equal terms? How do you explain losses to soldiers who want explanations that make sense, that fit within their understanding of how warfare works? The political officers did their best, creating narratives about Australian cowardice, about Western dependence on technology, about the inevitable triumph of the People's Revolution. But their soldiers had seen the ambush sites, had counted the bodies, had noticed that the phantoms never seemed to suffer casualties of their own. The narratives rang hollow against the evidence. By late 1968, Viet Cong units operating in Phuoc Tuy Province exhibited behaviors that intelligence analysts recognized as collective trauma response: increased desertion rates, refusal to follow orders, soldiers reporting sick with illnesses that had no physical symptoms, units spending more time on defensive preparations than offensive operations, hunkering down in their base areas rather than patrolling, losing the initiative that guerrilla warfare requires. The 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion, formidable units that had fought the French and survived early American operations, were effectively neutralized not through attrition, but through psychological collapse. American observers struggled to understand how this had happened. They examined Australian methods, interviewed SAS operators, studied the tactics and techniques. They tried to replicate the success through their own long-range reconnaissance patrol programs, through studies of operations, through attempts to incorporate Aboriginal tracking methods by recruiting Native American trackers. Some of this worked, some didn't, but none of it achieved the same results because they were trying to copy tactics while missing the underlying philosophy. The philosophy was simple and terrible in its implications. Become predators, not soldiers conducting military operations, not commandos on special missions. Predators hunting prey in an environment where you belonged and they did not. This required psychological transformation that most military organizations could not or would not facilitate, required men to access parts of themselves that civilization normally suppresses, parts that understood violence not as policy or duty, but as survival, as territory, as the oldest and most fundamental imperative of living things. One American major, a veteran of 3 tours with Mas V. Sog, spent 2 weeks at Nui Dat studying SAS methods. His classified report contained a paragraph that summarized findings in terms that made his superiors uncomfortable. The Australians have rediscovered something we forgot. War is not about technology or firepower. It is about men who are willing to become something less than civilized to survive. They have become predators. We are still thinking like soldiers. The report was classified, distributed to fewer than 20 recipients, never acted upon in any systematic way, because its implications threatened too many institutional interests. If small unit operations by highly trained specialists achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower, what did that say about force structure? About procurement priorities? About the entire American approach to warfare? Better to classify the questions than confront the answers. But the questions did not go away. They persisted in the minds of officers who had seen what the SAS accomplished, who had witnessed the effectiveness of methods that contradicted everything they had learned in staff colleges and war schools. Some of these officers would go on to influential positions in later years, would help shape the development of American special operations, would advocate for smaller, more specialized, more capable units. The legacy of Australian operations in Vietnam echoed through Delta Force, through SEAL Team 6, through every special mission unit that followed. The legacy was not tactics, which could be copied, but philosophy, which could not. The Battle of Long Tan, fought on August 18, 1966, demonstrated what Australian forces could achieve when every element of their tactical approach came together. It was not an SAS operation, but it illustrated principles that the SAS had been refining. D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, engaged a Viet Cong force later estimated at over 2,000 troops from the 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion. The fighting took place in a rubber plantation in driving rain that limited visibility and prevented effective air support. The Australians established defensive positions and fought off repeated assaults for 3 hours, relying on disciplined fire control, precise artillery support from New Zealand and Australian gunners at Nui Dat, and eventually reinforcement by armored personnel carriers that arrived with B Company. 18 Australians were killed, 24 wounded. Enemy casualties were estimated at over 245 killed, many more wounded or missing. The disparity in numbers would have destroyed most forces, but the Australians held because they understood, in their bones, that warfare came down to discipline, teamwork, proper use of supporting fires, and refusal to panic when everything seemed lost. Long Tan became iconic, the battle that Australians remember from Vietnam, the engagement that demonstrated their capabilities to allies and enemies alike. It showed that Australian forces could stand against overwhelming odds and prevail. It validated their approach to operations, their emphasis on small unit tactics and precise execution, and it provided a benchmark that the SAS would exceed repeatedly through their own operations, through ambushes and reconnaissance missions that achieved even more remarkable ratios without the same public recognition. The SAS kill ratio, somewhere between 17-1 and 30-1 depending on how you count, represented something unprecedented in modern warfare. In a conflict where most infantry units considered themselves fortunate to break even in casualty exchange, where the American average hovered around 1-1 or slightly better, the Australians achieved figures that seemed impossible. Military analysts studied these numbers for decades, trying to understand what they meant, what lessons could be extracted, what could be replicated. The consensus that emerged was uncomfortable for everyone involved. The numbers were real, verified by multiple sources, including enemy documents. They resulted from methods that worked but could not be easily scaled. They depended on individual quality that could not be mass-produced, on training that took years, not months, on selection processes that accepted only 1 in 12 candidates and ruthlessly culled anyone who did not meet standards. They required cultural factors specific to Australian military tradition, factors that resisted simple transplantation to other forces. Most fundamentally, they required operators to become comfortable with a level of violence and isolation that most people cannot sustain, living in jungle for weeks at a time, operating beyond supporting range of friendly forces, knowing that if things went wrong, if you were wounded or trapped, help might not arrive in time, making peace with the possibility of disappearing into the green, becoming another name on the missing in action lists, another unsolved mystery that families would grieve without closure. The psychological cost of this was substantial. Australian SAS veterans returned home with post-traumatic stress rates that exceeded their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer physical casualties. The transformation that made them devastatingly effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to think like predators, and predators do not easily return to civilian life. They had accessed parts of themselves that peace did not require and could not accommodate. The Australian government provided limited support for these veterans. The nation that had sent them to war did not fully understand what war had made of them, did not grasp that you cannot turn men into hunters and then expect them to become accountants or teachers without helping them navigate that transition. Many struggled. Many self-medicated with alcohol or other substances. Many ended up divorced, unemployed, adrift in a society that celebrated their service in abstract terms while failing to provide concrete assistance with the demons that service had created. This, too, was part of the Australian SAS story, not just the tactical successes and remarkable statistics, but the human cost of becoming something other than conventional soldiers, the price paid by men who volunteered for service, who served with distinction, who achieved what their nation asked of them, and who returned home to discover that their nation had no place for what they had become. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army developed their own understanding of Australian capabilities. Captured documents revealed detailed analyses of Australian tactics, specific warnings about SAS operations, standing orders about how to respond when Australian patrols were detected. The documents describe Australians in terms that mix military assessment with something approaching superstition. They are worse than Americans. They live in the jungle. They move like locals. They smell like locals. They appear without warning and disappear without trace. One particularly revealing document, a political officer's report from D445 Battalion in early 1969, described the effect of Australian operations on unit morale. Soldiers refusing patrol assignments, sentries reporting movement that investigation could not verify, troops spending excessive ammunition firing at shadows. The political officer recommended rotating the entire battalion out of Phuoc Tuy Province because psychological degradation had reached levels that threatened combat effectiveness. The recommendation was denied because forces could not be spared, but the assessment itself documented the extent of the problem. The North Vietnamese called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and the name captured something essential about how they were perceived, not as foreign soldiers, not even as particularly capable enemies, but as something outside normal categories, something that belonged to the jungle itself, and used that belonging to hunt those who did not belong. In Vietnamese folklore, spirits inhabit wild places and sometimes interact with the human world, usually to punish those who have offended against proper behavior or ventured where they should not go. The SAS became modern manifestation of these ancient stories, ghosts that punished the living for presuming control over territory that would never be controlled. This perception, deliberately cultivated through psychological operations or arising naturally from the nature of SAS activities, created effects disproportionate to the actual size of Australian forces. 120 men could not physically control an entire province, could not be everywhere, could not prevent all enemy movement, could not shut down Viet Cong operations through numbers alone. But they created the perception of being everywhere, of watching constantly, of ready to strike at any moment. And perception in guerrilla warfare matters as much as reality, sometimes more than reality. By 1969, Phuoc Tuy Province had effectively become Australian territory. Not because the Viet Cong had been eliminated, they remained in reduced numbers, but because the Australians had achieved psychological dominance. Enemy forces still operated, still conducted attacks, still pursued their objectives, but they did so with degraded effectiveness, with constant awareness that they were being watched, with fear that shaped every decision and limited every operation. American forces elsewhere in Vietnam faced enemies who remained confident, aggressive, willing to take casualties in pursuit of victory. Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy faced enemies who wanted to survive, who had lost the revolutionary confidence that sustains guerrilla movements, who fought because they had to, but no longer believed in ultimate success. The difference was stark, and it showed in operational results, in pacification metrics, in every measure of effectiveness that analysts could devise. The cost of achieving this was measured in different currencies, in the lives of SAS operators who did not come home, in the psychological health of those who did, in the Vietnamese civilians caught between forces, subject to interrogation by both sides, their villages searched, their lives disrupted by a war they did not choose, in the Viet Cong soldiers who died in ambushes, who disappeared during routine patrols, who became statistics in reports that justified continued operations. War creates these costs regardless of how it is conducted. The Australian approach minimized their own casualties while maximizing enemy losses, an equation that any military commander would recognize as favorable. But favorable does not mean costless, does not mean clean, does not mean that the moral weight of what was done somehow vanishes because it achieved tactical success. The men who walked those patrols, who set those ambushes, who became hunters in the jungle, they carried the weight afterward even when their nation did not fully acknowledge it. The Australian withdrawal from Vietnam began in 1970 and concluded in 1971. The SAS departed along with the rest of 1st Australian Task Force, leaving behind the territory they had controlled, the networks they had built, the psychological dominance they had achieved. Within months, Viet Cong units began returning to Phuoc Tuy Province, reclaiming positions they had abandoned, resuming operations that Australian presence had suppressed. The war continued for 4 more years, until North Vietnamese victory in 1975. What the Australians had achieved did not persist without them, because it depended on their presence, their methods, their willingness to live in the jungle and hunt their enemies with patient determination. It could not be transferred to South Vietnamese forces who lacked the training, the cultural factors, the individual quality that Australian operations required. It could not be sustained by American forces who were drawing down their own presence and had never fully adopted Australian methods anyway. So in the end, the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam became a chapter in military history, studied in staff colleges and special operations schools, analyzed for lessons that could be extracted and applied elsewhere. Some of those lessons transferred well: the value of small unit operations, the importance of patience and fieldcraft, the psychological effects of operating behind enemy lines, the integration of indigenous knowledge with Western military training. Other lessons resisted transfer because they depended on factors that could not be easily replicated. The unique Australian military culture, the relationship between Aboriginal trackers and European soldiers, the specific terrain and political conditions of Phuoc Tuy Province, the willingness of Australian society to send soldiers on long deployments with limited numbers, accepting the risk that small forces faced in hostile territory. The numbers themselves became almost mythological: 1,200 patrols, 600 enemy killed, fewer than 10 lost to enemy action, kill ratios approaching 30-1. These figures entered military lore as examples of what could be achieved, as standards against which other special operations forces measured themselves, as evidence that under the right conditions, with the right people and the right methods, small units could achieve disproportionate results. But the numbers tell only part of the story, the part that fits neatly into spreadsheets and operational summaries. They do not capture the experience of walking through triple canopy jungle for days without speaking, without making sound, moving so slowly that time itself seemed to stop. They do not convey the sensation of watching enemy forces from concealment, close enough to hear conversations, close enough to smell their cooking, knowing that discovery meant death and that survival depended on absolute stillness. They do not communicate the violence of ambushes, the sudden eruption from silence into chaos, the screams and explosions, and then silence again as patrols melted back into jungle. They do not account for nights spent in defensive positions, knowing that enemy forces might be searching, might be close, might stumble upon your location at any moment. They do not measure the accumulated stress of weeks in the field, the physical breakdown from heat and humidity and limited rations, the mental strain of constant vigilance. They do not quantify the relief of extraction, of stepping onto helicopters and leaving hostile territory behind, or the difficulty of transitioning back to base routines after days or weeks of operating on pure survival instinct. The men who conducted these operations returned home to Australia and found themselves changed by what they had experienced and what they had become. Some adapted successfully, found ways to integrate their wartime selves with civilian life, built careers and families and futures. Others struggled, could not find their place in a society that honored their service abstractly while failing to understand it concretely. They had been asked to become something specific, something necessary for the mission, and they had succeeded. But success came with costs that lasted longer than their tours of duty. Australian society's relationship with Vietnam veterans was complex and often painful. The war itself was controversial, support for Australian involvement declining as casualties mounted and victory seemed increasingly distant. Returning soldiers sometimes faced protests rather than parades, accusations rather than appreciation, a public that wanted to forget the war, and by extension wanted to forget those who had fought it. This was not universal. Many Australians remained supportive, but the division was real, and it affected veterans who had expected their nation to welcome them home. The SAS veterans faced additional challenges specific to their service. They had operated under levels of classification that prevented them from discussing their work with anyone lacking proper clearances. They had been told that certain operations, certain methods, certain aspects of what they had done were not to be discussed publicly. This created isolation, an inability to process experiences through conversation, a sense that they carried knowledge they could never share, and memories they had to bear alone. Slowly, over decades, some of this began to change. Declassification of operational records, publication of unit histories and veteran memoirs, academic studies that examined Australian operations in Vietnam with scholarly rigor, public recognition that the soldiers who served deserved better than they had received. Vietnam Veterans Day, established to commemorate the Battle of Long Tan and, by extension, all Australian service in Vietnam. Monuments and memorials that acknowledged sacrifice even as debate continued about the war itself. But recognition came late for many. Came after careers had faltered, families had fractured, health had declined. Came after some veterans had already succumbed to the cumulative effects of trauma, to suicide, to the diseases that would eventually be linked to chemical exposure in Vietnam. Recognition could not restore lost decades or repair damage that had become permanent. It could only acknowledge, belatedly, that the nation owed debts it had been slow to pay. The Australian SAS itself continued to evolve. Operations in East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other deployments demonstrated that the capabilities developed in Vietnam remained relevant. The methods refined in Phuoc Tuy Province, adapted to different terrain and different enemies, continued to prove effective. The selection and training pipeline continued to produce operators of exceptional quality, men who volunteered for service that would demand everything and provide limited recognition. But the shadow of Vietnam remained in the classified archives that still hold portions of the operational record, in the memories of veterans who cannot discuss what they saw and did, in the questions that historians continue to explore about what was achieved and at what cost, and whether the same results could be achieved today. In the ongoing debate about the balance between operational effectiveness and ethical constraints, between winning tactically and maintaining values that define who we are as societies, the Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and that name captured something essential that no official designation could convey. They became something other than conventional soldiers, became hunters who belonged to the jungle, and used that belonging to stalk prey that could not see them coming, could not fight back effectively, could not escape the patience and skill and determination that tracked them through terrain they thought they controlled. They achieved results that seemed impossible through methods that could not be easily replicated. They paid prices that are still being counted, still being understood, still affecting lives decades after their tours ended. This is their story, not the sanitized version that appears in official histories, not the romanticized version that appears in popular media. The complex, difficult, troubling story of what they became, what they accomplished, what it cost them and their enemies and the civilians caught between. The story of five-man patrols that changed the nature of warfare in their operational area. The story of psychological operations that degraded enemy effectiveness without firing shots. The story of men who learned to hunt other men and who carried that knowledge the rest of their lives. The numbers tell part of this story. 1,200 patrols, 600 confirmed enemy killed, kill ratios approaching 30 to 1, combat losses of fewer than 10 men. These statistics represent achievement that military forces worldwide still study and attempt to understand, but they represent something else as well. They represent the price of becoming predators in an environment that required it. They represent the transformation that war demands from those who fight it. They represent the gap between what we ask soldiers to do and what we provide them when they return. The last thing many Viet Cong soldiers saw was nothing. That was the point. The Australians moved through jungle without disturbing it, positioned themselves without being detected, struck without warning, and vanished without trace. The fear this created, the psychological degradation it caused, achieved effects that conventional operations could not match. It neutralized enemy forces through terror rather than attrition, through collapse of will rather than destruction of capability. It was brutally effective and deeply troubling in ways that comfortable distance of history cannot fully erase. This was the Australian SAS in Vietnam. Not heroes in the simple sense that propaganda requires. Not villains in the simple sense that critics might claim. Something more complex, more human, more difficult to categorize. Soldiers who did what their nation asked. Operators who achieved remarkable results through methods that raised questions their commanders preferred not to answer. Men who became something other than what they had been, and who lived with the consequences long after the war ended. Their story deserves to be told completely, honestly, with all its complexity and contradiction, because they earned that much, because the truth matters even when it is uncomfortable, because 5-man patrols that vanished into the jungle and emerged with results that shaped an entire province deserve more than simplified narratives that miss the essential complexity of what they were and what they became. The jungle ghosts, Ma Rung. They walked into the green and became part of it. They hunted and killed and survived when survival seemed impossible. They came home changed, and many never fully returned. This is what they achieved. This is what it cost. This is why the Viet Cong feared them. And this is why their story, decades later, still resonates with anyone who understands that war transforms those who fight it in ways that statistics cannot capture and history struggles to acknowledge.